Most people think Rome was unstoppable. But for 400 years, one enemy humiliated Rome again and again. It took a Roman emperor alive and kept him until he died, and the stories say his captor used him as a footstool to climb onto his horse, and Rome never conquered them. So why could Rome beat everyone and never beat Persia? Because it did beat them. That is the part that makes this strange. And it is the fact this whole video turns on, so hold on to it. Rome captured the Persian capital. Not once. 4 separate Roman armies marched down the Euphrates and the Tigris and took the great city of Ctesiphon, burned it or looted it or occupied it, and sent word home that the Eastern War was won. 4 times, spread across 170 years, Rome achieved the thing that is supposed to end a war. And 4 times, within a few years, sometimes within a few months, the frontier snapped back to almost exactly the line it had been on before, as though the whole campaign had been a stone dropped in a pond. Rome could beat Persia. Rome could beat Persia in the field, take its capital, and sack it, and it changed nothing. That is not how conquest is supposed to work, and there is a reason for it, and the reason is the most interesting thing about this war. So hold the question in that sharper form for the next hour, because everything hangs off it. Not, why did Rome lose to Persia? Because mostly, Rome did not lose to Persia. Why could Rome win over and over and never make the winning stick? We are going to follow it all the way through. We will watch the first Roman army to try it get destroyed in a single afternoon by an enemy it could not catch. We will watch an emperor go into a Persian prison and never come out. We will go down a tunnel under a city on the Euphrates where archaeologists found 20 Roman soldiers stacked in a heap, and we will look at what modern chemistry says actually killed them, which is a thing nobody thought the ancient world could do. We will watch the single most reckless invasion in Roman history and the man who let it die in a way that changed the religion of Europe. And at the end, the two of them, Rome and Persia, after 700 years, will finally fight the war that settles it, the total war, the one where both sides throw in everything. And I want you to remember at that point that both of them are about to be beaten by a third party that neither of them had bothered to look at. Before we start, if long documentaries like this are worth your time, a like and a subscribe genuinely decide whether more of them get made, and if you can see the hype button, press it. It costs you nothing, and it pushes a video like this very hard. And answer this one in the comments before we begin, because it is the number that surprised me most while making this. Across the whole 700 years, how many years do you think Rome and Persia were actually at war with each other, out of all of them? Write your guess below. I will give you the real figure at the end. Now, to understand why Rome could not finish Persia, you first have to understand how Rome ended up standing on the Euphrates at all. Because Rome did not go east on purpose. Rome fell east, the way a man falls downstairs, one step at a time, each step perfectly reasonable. Go back to the 2nd century before Christ. Rome has just finished Carthage, it has just finished Macedon, and it now owns the Western Mediterranean, without seriously intending to. In the east, there is a scatter of Greek kingdoms left over from the breakup of Alexander's empire, and the largest of them, the Seleucid Empire, is a long, thin sprawl running from the coast of Syria across Mesopotamia and out onto the Iranian plateau. Rome does not conquer the Seleucids. Rome does something much more Roman. It beats them once, in the year 190 before Christ, takes their fleet and their war elephants away, finds them an enormous sum, and tells them not to come west of the Taurus Mountains again. And then it goes home and lets the kingdom rot in place for a century. While it rotted, something was coming the other way. Around the middle of the 3rd century before Christ, a people called the Parni, a horse-riding confederation out of the steppe east of the Caspian Sea, moved into the province of Parthia in what is now northeastern Iran and took it. Their leader was called Arsaces, and the line he founded, the Arsacids, spent the next 150 years eating the Seleucid Empire from the inside out, province by province, until by about the year 140 before Christ, they held Mesopotamia, the richest agricultural land in the world outside Egypt, and had planted their winter capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris, 20 miles from where Baghdad would later stand. So by the 70s before Christ, you have two expanding powers, one moving east and one moving west, and one shrinking Greek kingdom left in the middle, and everyone can see what is about to happen. In the year 69 before Christ, the Roman general Lucullus, chasing a different enemy, crossed the upper Euphrates for the first time, which is the moment the two systems come into contact. And in 66, Pompey arrived to finish the job. And Pompey did what Rome always did, which was to redraw the entire map of a region in a couple of campaigning seasons, and then present it as a settlement. He abolished the Seleucid kingdom outright and made Syria a Roman province. He installed and removed kings across Armenia and the Caucasus. And when the Parthian king, who was called Phraates III, wrote to him proposing that they formally recognize the Euphrates as the border between the two empires, Pompey did not accept and did not refuse. He simply did not answer the question. He also stopped addressing the Parthian king as King of Kings in his letters and used the plain title King instead, which sounds like nothing and was in fact the diplomatic equivalent of a slap. Rome did not do borders with equals. Rome had clients and Rome had enemies, and it had no third category to put Parthia in. That refusal is the beginning of everything. Rome now shared a river with a state it had declined to acknowledge, and the river was 1,800 miles from Rome, and the Roman commanders posted to Syria were ambitious men whose careers depended on wars. All that was needed was one man with a large enough reason. He arrived in the year 54 before Christ, and he was the richest man in the world. Marcus Licinius Crassus was around 60. He had made a colossal fortune out of the prescriptions of Sulla, buying the confiscated property of murdered men at a discount, and out of a private fire brigade that famously negotiated the price of a burning house before it put the fire out. He had crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus and had the survivors crucified along the road from Capua to Rome, and had then watched Pompey arrive at the end of that war, kill a few fugitives, and take most of the credit. He was in a political partnership with Pompey and with Julius Caesar, the arrangement we call the First Triumvirate, and by the mid-50s, Caesar was in Gaul making a reputation that was starting to frighten everyone. And Pompey had his eastern conquests, and Crassus, who had more money than either of them, had a war against slaves and a grudge. So he took Syria, and he went east not because Parthia had attacked Rome, which it had not, and not because the Senate wanted a war, which it did not. One tribune formally cursed him as he left the city, and another tried to have him arrested at the gates. He went because the Parthian Empire was the last unlooted thing on the map, because Alexander had gone that way, and because at 60, he had one campaign left in him, and he wanted it to be the one people talked about. He had 7 legions, around 35 to 40,000 heavy infantry, the best in the world at what they did. He had about 4,000 cavalry, which was not many, and around 4,000 light troops. He had his son Publius, a genuinely capable young officer who had served under Caesar in Gaul and who brought 1,000 Gallic horsemen with him. What he did not have was any real idea of what he was walking into, and neither, to be fair, did anyone in Rome, because Rome had never fought this enemy. And this is the point to stop following Crassus and cross the river ahead of him and look at the thing he was marching towards. Because everything that goes wrong for Rome in this video, for the next 700 years, goes wrong for reasons that are already sitting there in the structure of the Parthian Empire in the year 54 before Christ, waiting. Start with the shape of it. The Roman Empire was, in the end, a machine for turning conquered land into Roman land. It took a place, put a garrison in it, ran a road to it, taxed it, and after a century or two, the people living there thought of themselves as Romans and their grandchildren were serving in the legions. It was a solvent. The Parthian Empire was not that at all. It was an umbrella. The King of Kings ruled directly over a core of territory, and everything else was a patchwork of subject kingdoms, Greek cities with their own councils and their own coinage, and above all, great noble houses. 7 of them by tradition, the Suran, the Charon, the Miron, and the rest, who held vast territories in the east and the north, kept their own private armies, and had the hereditary right to a role in making the king. There was no standing national army in the Roman sense. When the King of Kings went to war, he asked the houses, and they came, with their retainers and their horses, and the size of the army was a function of how much they liked him that year. If you are Rome, this looks like weakness, and in one narrow sense it is, because a Parthian king could rarely put a very large army in the field quickly, and could almost never keep it there through a long siege. But look at what it does to you when you try to conquer it. Take the Roman way of ending a war, which is to march on the capital, take it, and dictate terms to whoever is inside. Parthia had no capital in that sense. It had Ctesiphon on the Tigris, which was the winter residence, and the administrative center and the richest prize, and it had Ecbatana up in the Zagros mountains where the court went in summer to escape the heat, and it had Susa, and it had Hecatompylos and Nisa away out east, and the King of Kings moved between them with his court on his back. Burning Ctesiphon hurt him, financially and in prestige, but it did not remove him, because he was not in it. He was 400 miles away in the mountains, and the mountains are the second half of the problem. Look at the terrain, because this is a geography video as much as a war one. The Roman way into Persia is down the river valleys of Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia is flat, hot, watered, and full of cities. And a Roman army can march there, and eat there, and besiege there, and be very good at all of it. But Mesopotamia is not Iran. Iran begins where the flat land stops, at the Zagros Mountains, a wall of ridges running for nearly 1,000 miles. And behind them, a high dry plateau, with deserts in the middle of it, that make the Sahara look hospitable. Every Roman army that ever took Ctesiphon stood on the Tigris looking at that wall, with its supply line already 800 miles long, in a country where the harvest is over by June and there is no fodder, and had to make a decision. And every single one of them made the same decision, which was that this is far enough. Rome could reach the Persian heartland's front door. Rome could not get into the house. And a Persian king who lost Mesopotamia had lost his richest province and his prestige, but he still had Iran, and Iran is where the horses came from. Which brings us to the army, and to the two things on the battlefield that Rome had no answer for. The first is the horse archer. A Parthian light cavalryman rode a small, tough step horse without stirrups, which had not been invented, and carried a composite bow, a recurved weapon built up in layers of wood, horn, and sinew, glued and bound and cured for years, and it threw an arrow with a power that a plain wooden bow of the same size cannot come close to. He did not skirmish and then close. He never closed. He rode at your formation, shot, wheeled away, and shot backwards over the tail of his horse as he went. The shot the Romans came to call the Parthian shot. And if you have ever heard the phrase, a parting shot, that is where it comes from. And it has been used in English for 400 years by people who have no idea they are describing a specific tactic used against Roman infantry in the year 53 before Christ. The point of the horse archer is not that his arrows are unstoppable. It is that he sets the terms of the fight. You cannot make him fight you. You can only stand there. The second is the cataphract, and the cataphract is what happens after you have stood there for a while. This is a heavy shock cavalryman, and both the man and the horse are armored, scale or mail hanging to the knee, the horse in a coat of metal plates or hardened leather, sometimes with a faceplate. He carries a lance called a kontos, so heavy it is used two-handed, and he is not maneuverable, and he is not fast, and he does not need to be, because he is aimed at an infantry formation that arrows have already loosened. Roman heavy infantry in good order is close to unbreakable from the front. Roman heavy infantry that has spent 4 hours under arrow fire, that is closed up tight behind its shields to survive the arrows, that is packed shoulder to shoulder and cannot see out, is exactly the target a cataphract charge is designed for. The two arms work together, and each one makes the other lethal. Spread out to reduce the arrow casualties, and the cataphracts ride into the gaps. Close up to survive the cataphracts, and the archers cannot miss. Rome's own cavalry, at this point in its history, was an afterthought, a screen of allied horsemen used for scouting and pursuit. Rome had spent 3 centuries proving that disciplined heavy infantry beats everything, and it was right, it did beat everything, in Italy and Spain and Gaul and Greece, in country where the enemy has to come to you because he has villages and fields and a capital to defend. In an open plain against an enemy who has none of those things and who would rather ride away than fight you, the greatest infantry in the world is a very expensive way of occupying ground that nobody wanted. There is one more thing to understand about Parthia, and it is not military at all. It is commercial, and it explains a lot of Parthian behavior that otherwise looks like simple hostility. Parthia sat on the middle section of the Silk Road. Everything moving between China and the Mediterranean, and by the 1st century that meant a torrent of silk that Pliny the Elder claimed was draining 100 million sesterces a year out of the Roman economy, went through Parthian hands and paid Parthian tolls. Parthia's most valuable asset was not a province. It was the fact that Rome and China could not talk to each other except through Parthia, and Parthia protected that asset. There is a small, wonderful, well-documented moment that proves it, and it happens a century and a half after Crassus, in the year 97 after Christ. The Han Chinese general Ban Chao, having pushed Chinese power right across Central Asia, sent an envoy named Gan Ying west with orders to reach the empire the Chinese called Da Qin, which was Rome. Gan Ying got as far as the Persian Gulf, and he stood on the shore, and he asked the Parthian sailors there about the crossing. And they told him that the voyage could take 2 years, that men had to carry 3 years of provisions, and that the sea makes men long for their homes so terribly that some of them die of it. So Gan Ying turned round and went home, and wrote it all down. The 2 greatest empires on earth, each holding roughly a quarter of the human race, never established contact. And one reason they never did is a group of sailors on a beach who understood exactly what would happen to their margins if the 2 ends of the Silk Road ever met. That is a whole other video, and I will make it, but keep it in mind, because it tells you what kind of state Parthia was, not a horde, a business. So that is what was waiting on the other side of the river. A decentralized empire with no single vital organ, sitting behind a mountain wall, funded by trade, fielding an army designed around exactly the 2 things Rome could not do anything about, and run by nobles who would fight furiously in defense of Mesopotamia and who could not be made to fight at all if they did not feel like it. Crassus knew almost none of this. In the spring of the year 53 before Christ, he took his 7 legions across the Euphrates at Zeugma and marched them out into open country. And the local kings and the Greek cities and his own officers all told him to keep to the hills of Armenia, where cavalry could not work properly, and he decided instead to strike straight across the plain for Seleucia, because it was faster, because an Arab chieftain named Ariamnes told him the Parthians were fleeing, and because he had spent his whole life being the man who arrived after the fighting was over, and he was not going to do it again. The Parthian king, Orodes II, had split his response in 2. He took the main royal army north into Armenia to knock Rome's ally out of the war. And he sent the field army in Mesopotamia to shadow Crassus under the command of a young nobleman of the house of Cyrene, whom our sources call by his family name, Cyrena. He was around 30. Plutarch, who is our best account and who is drawing on a lost eyewitness, says he was the 2nd man in the empire after the king, that he was extraordinarily rich, and that when he traveled he was accompanied by 1,000 camels for his baggage and 200 wagons for his concubines. He had about 9,000 horse archers and 1,000 cataphracts. He had 1/10 of Crassus's heavy infantry, and no infantry worth the name at all. And he had done one thing that nobody in the ancient world seems to have done before him, and it is the detail that decides the battle. He had brought a baggage train of camels loaded with arrows. Everybody who had ever fought horse archers knew the counter. You endure it. Archers carry perhaps 30 arrows in a quiver, and a man shooting from horseback burns through them fast. And when the quivers are empty, the horsemen have to leave to refill them, and that is your window. Roman armies had beaten light cavalry in Spain and Numidia by absorbing the first hour and then getting hold of them. Cyrena had looked at that counter and quietly removed it. His camels stood behind the line, and his archers rode back to them, filled their quivers, and returned. And the arrow storm did not slacken, and did not stop. And the Roman army, waiting for it to stop, waited all day. They made contact in the late morning of a day in June, near the town of Carrhae, which the Old Testament calls Haran. The Roman scouts came back and reported the enemy in sight, and then reported that there were a great many of them. Crassus formed his army first into a long line and then, nervous of being outflanked, into a hollow square, 12 cohorts to a side, cavalry distributed around it, baggage inside. It is a formation for not losing. It concedes the initiative completely. Plutarch says the Parthians came on first with their armor covered in cloaks and skins, so that what the Romans saw was a dull mass, and then, at a signal, they threw the covers off and the whole plain lit up at once, the polished steel and bronze of the cataphracts flashing, and the drums started. Not trumpets, drums. Big hollow vessels covered with hide and hung with bronze bells, and they made a deep rolling noise that Plutarch says was like thunder mixed with the roaring of animals. And he specifically notes that the Parthians had understood something about how sound works on men before a battle. Shapur tested the square once with the cataphracts, saw that it was too deep and too solid to break, and pulled them back. And then the horse archers went to work, and they did it for the rest of the day. The arrows came in continuously, and they came from every direction, because the Romans were in a square, and the Parthians simply rode around it. The Roman shield, the scutum, is a very good shield, and behind it, a legionary was mostly safe. And this is the detail that turns the battle from a defeat into a horror, mostly safe. A composite bow at close range will punch through a shield, and the men who were not killed were pinned, hands nailed to shields, feet nailed to the ground, and the wounded could not be got out, because there was nowhere to take them. Crassus, seeing that standing still was killing him slowly, ordered his son Publius to take a detachment out and drive the archers off. Publius took 1,300 cavalry, including his Gauls, 500-foot archers, and 8 cohorts of legionaries, around 4,000 men, and went. The Parthians in front of him turned and fled, which was the point, and Publius pursued them, which was also the point. And when he was far enough from the square to be out of sight of it, the fleeing enemy stopped, and the cataphracts came round on both sides, and it was over. Plutarch's description of what the Gauls did in that last hour is one of the most vivid passages in ancient literature. Men grabbing the Parthian lances and wrestling with them, dismounted riders crawling under the armored horses to stab them in the belly. And it did not matter. Publius was wounded in the hand and could not hold a sword, and he ordered his shield-bearer to kill him. The survivors were driven onto a low hillock and shot to pieces. Around 500 were taken alive out of 4,000. And then the Parthians came back to the square, and they had Publius's head on a spear, and they rode along the Roman line asking whose son this was, because a man of such family could not possibly be the child of a coward like Crassus. The army held out until dark. In the night, the Parthians withdrew, because horse archers do not fight at night, and the Roman officers held a council, which Crassus did not attend, because he was lying on the ground with his cloak over his face. They abandoned 4,000 wounded men in the camp, who were killed the next morning, and made for the walls of Carrhae. Then out of Carrhae, at night, towards the Armenian hills, guided by a local who may have been in Parthian pay, and one column got lost in marshes, and another got to the high ground and lived. And Crassus, with the largest group, was still on the low ground when the sun came up. Shapur offered a parley. He announced, loudly enough for the Roman soldiers to hear it, that the king wished to make peace and that the terms would be discussed with Crassus in person. Crassus did not want to go. His soldiers, who could see the hills they were not going to reach, made him go. And there is something worth sitting with in the fact that the end of the richest man in the world was decided by the men he had led there, who had had enough. What happened at the meeting is unclear in the sources. A scuffle over a horse, a Roman officer grabbing a bridle, and in the confusion Crassus was killed. Around 20,000 Romans died in the campaign, and around 10,000 were taken prisoner. The prisoners are worth a sentence, because they vanish into the far east of the Parthian Empire, and they will come back into this channel one day. They were settled at Merv, in Margiana, on the frontier facing Central Asia, which is what Parthia did with captured professional soldiers. Put them at the other end of the empire, where they cannot walk home. And a Chinese chronicle, writing about a battle fought 17 years later, 2,000 miles further east, describes a body of foot soldiers drawn up in what it calls a fish-scale formation. And a historian in 1941 looked at that phrase and thought of a testudo. And an argument started that is still going. That is the next video. Do not let me start on it here. There was a famous coda. The head of Crassus was carried to the Armenian court, where the Parthian king Orodes and the Armenian king were celebrating a marriage alliance with a performance of the Bacchae of Euripides. And the head was brought in and used as a stage property in the scene where the queen carries the head of her son. And the story everyone knows, that the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat as a comment on his greed, is in Cassius Dio, writing 2.5 centuries later. And it is almost certainly a moral fable rather than a report. But the 7 eagles were real. 7 legionary standards, the sacred objects of the Roman army, were now in Parthian temples, and in Rome that was the wound that would not close. Here is the thing to notice about Carrhae, though, and it is why I have spent this long on it. Carrhae did not cost Rome 1 acre of territory, not one. The Parthians pushed into Syria the following year and were beaten and thrown back out by the remaining Roman garrison under a quaestor named Cassius, the same Cassius who would help kill Julius Caesar. Militarily, the greatest disaster in Roman Eastern history changed the border not at all. What it changed was the way Rome thought, and what Rome thought was not, this is an enemy we cannot conquer. What Rome thought was, we must get the eagles back, and someone is going to be very famous for doing it. Which brings us to the second attempt, and to the man who should have known better. Mark Antony had been at Philippi and had taken the eastern half of the Roman world in the carve-up that followed Caesar's murder. And in the year 36 before Christ, he invaded Parthia with the largest army Rome had ever sent east, something like 60,000 legionaries plus allies, perhaps 100,000 men in total. He had learned from Crassus. He went north, through Armenia, into the highlands, where cavalry works less well. He had strong cavalry of his own. He knew what he was doing. And he lost about 1/3 of his army anyway, to a supply problem. Impatient to reach the fortress city of Fraspa, before the season closed, he pushed ahead with the legions and left his siege train, 300 wagons carrying an 80-foot battering ram and the artillery. Behind under a guard of 2 legions, the Parthians found the siege train, destroyed the guard, and burned the machinery. Antony was now sitting in front of a walled city he had no means of breaking into, in autumn, in the mountains. He tried, failed, and began the retreat. And the retreat took 27 days and was harried the entire way. He lost perhaps 24,000 men, most of them not in battle but to cold, disease, thirst, and exhaustion. He did not lose a single major engagement. He was simply worn down by geography, with an enemy attached to it. 2 invasions, 2 of the most experienced armies in Roman history, 2 catastrophes, and neither one of them a defeat in the way Rome understood defeat. And so, the third Roman to try, who was the most intelligent politician the Roman world produced, did something completely different, and it worked so well that everyone forgot how it was done. Augustus, when the Eastern question came to him in the year 20 before Christ, did not invade. He mobilized. He put his stepson Tiberius on the Armenian border with an army and the visible intention of using it, and at the same time he opened negotiations with the Parthian king Phraates IV, whose throne was insecure and who had a rival claimant to worry about and whose own son was awkwardly a hostage in Rome, and a deal was struck. The eagles lost at Carrhae, and the surviving prisoners came home. There was no war. The frontier did not move. And then Augustus went home and through the greatest publicity campaign of the ancient world. The return of the standards was minted onto coins, celebrated in the poetry of Horace and Propertius, and carved onto the breastplate of the statue of him that stands today in the Vatican, the Prima Porta Augustus, where you can look at the central panel and see a Parthian handing a legionary eagle to a Roman. If you did not know better, and no Roman citizen in the provinces did, you would swear you were looking at a conquest. It was a negotiated exchange of property between 2 states, and it was sold as a surrender, and Augustus, who was not a fool and had read the reports on Crassus and Antony, quietly wrote into his political testament the advice that the empire should be kept within its existing boundaries. So for the next century and a bit, that held, more or less. Rome and Parthia fought over Armenia repeatedly, because Armenia was the buffer both of them wanted, and the wars were real and expensive. But the eastern frontier stayed roughly where Pompey had left it, and the 2 empires developed something the Roman world had with nobody else, which was a working relationship. They exchanged embassies. They agreed on the status of Armenia in the year 63 after Christ in a compromise that lasted 50 years, a Parthian prince ruling as king of Armenia but crowned by Rome. Trade moved. Roman glass has been dug up in China, and Chinese silk was worn in Rome, and both of them traveled through Parthia, and both of them paid Parthian tolls. Which raises the question that the second half of this video is about. If it was stable, if both sides had adjusted to it, if Augustus had explicitly warned against going further, then why did Rome keep going back? The answer is that Rome had an internal engine that made Eastern wars irresistible, and it had nothing to do with strategy. A Roman emperor's legitimacy rested on military glory, and by the 2nd century after Christ, there was almost nowhere left to get any. Britain was a wet dead end. Germany was where Augustus had lost 3 legions, and the lesson had been learned. Africa was desert. The East was the only direction in which a Roman emperor could win a war that people had heard of, against an enemy with cities worth capturing and treasure worth parading, in the footsteps of Alexander. And every emperor who needed a reputation looked at the map and saw the same thing. The eastern frontier was not a strategic problem. It was a career opportunity, and it stayed one for 400 years. Trajan went first, in the year 114, and Trajan is the high watermark of the entire Roman Empire. He annexed Armenia outright. He came down through Mesopotamia in 2 campaigning seasons, took city after city, and in 116 he entered Ctesiphon, and the Parthian king fled east. And Trajan pushed all the way down the Tigris to the Persian Gulf and stood on the shore. And Cassius Dio says he watched a ship set sail for India and said that if he were younger he would have gone on to India himself. He declared the province of Mesopotamia annexed and issued coins reading Parthia Capta, Parthia captured. It is the single most complete victory any Roman ever won against the Eastern Empire. It lasted about 18 months. While Trajan was at the Gulf, the whole of the conquered territory rose behind him, city after city, along with a massive Jewish revolt in the rear provinces. And his generals spent the next year fighting back up the line they had just come down. Trajan besieged the desert fortress of Hatra and failed to take it, and fell ill and turned for home, and died in Cilicia in the summer of 117. His successor Hadrian, on the first day of his reign, gave the entire conquest back, all of it. Armenia, Mesopotamia, everything, abandoned on the grounds that it could not be held, and Hadrian took the political damage of that decision on the chin for the rest of his life. Ctesiphon captured, king driven out, coins struck, border after 2 years, unchanged. Second time. In the year 165, in the War of Lucius Verus, the Roman general Avidius Cassius came down the Euphrates and took Seleucia and Ctesiphon and burned the royal palace. Total victory. Again. And the army that took the city came home carrying something, and what it carried is called the Antonine Plague, and it went through the Roman Empire for 15 years and killed, on modern estimates, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population of the entire empire, possibly far more in the cities, and it is arguably the beginning of Rome's long structural decline. That is what Rome got for taking Ctesiphon the second time. The border, needless to say, did not move. Third time. In the year 197, Septimius Severus, who needed a victory to legitimize a throne he had won in a civil war, came east and took Ctesiphon and sacked it thoroughly. And the sources say he took 100,000 captives, and he too failed to take Hatra twice and went home. He did keep a slice of northern Mesopotamia this time and fortified it, and it became a Roman province with legions in it, which is the one lasting territorial gain in this whole story. And what it bought Rome was a permanent forward frontier that was expensive to hold and that put Roman garrisons within a few days' ride of the Persian heartland, which is to say it converted an intermittent war into a permanent one. 3 Roman armies in the Persian capital in 81 years, 3 complete victories, and the net result at the end of it was one thin province, a plague, and an enemy that had been humiliated 3 times and had learned, in the most direct way available, that its entire political system was inadequate to the threat. That is the part nobody mentions. Rome's victories did not weaken Persia. they reformed it. Because in the year 224, in the province of Fars in southern Iran, the old heartland where the first Persian Empire had come from 700 years before, a local ruler named Ardashir, son of Papak, of a family attached to a fire temple at Istakar, went to war against his own king of kings, and at a battlefield we call Hormozgan he killed Artabanus, the fourth, the last of the Arsacids. In what the tradition says was single combat. 2 years later he was crowned in Ctesiphon, and the empire he founded is called the Sasanian Empire, after his grandfather Sasan, and it lasted 400 years, and it is the state that Rome will still be fighting when both of them fall. And the Sasanian Empire was different in every way that mattered to Rome. It was centralized. The great noble houses were still there and still powerful, but the crown broke and rebuilt the relationship, took direct control of far more territory, and built a bureaucracy with a tax system attached to it. And a king of kings could now raise armies out of a treasury rather than out of a negotiation. It had a state religion, Zoroastrianism, organized into a hierarchy of priests, with the king as its protector, and that gave the wars an ideological edge the Parthians had never bothered with. It built cities on purpose, and its kings spent captured Roman engineers on dams and bridges that are still standing. It developed heavier cavalry, and, crucially, it learned to besiege, which the Parthians had never mastered, borrowing Roman siege engineering from Roman prisoners and using it against Roman walls. And it came with acclaim. The Sasanians presented themselves as the heirs of the Achaemenids, the empire of Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes that Alexander had destroyed, and they asserted a hereditary right to everything the Achaemenids had ruled, which included Syria, Anatolia, and Egypt. Whether Ardashir personally believed that or whether it was propaganda for domestic consumption, Roman writers heard it and reported it. And from the 220s onwards, the Roman East is dealing with a neighbor that has publicly stated it intends to take Antioch. So the war restarts, and it restarts at the worst possible moment for Rome, because Rome is about to enter the 50-year breakdown we call the crisis of the 3rd century. And if you want that story in full, I have a whole video on it. What matters here is the timing. In the exact decades when Rome is murdering an emperor every couple of years, and its currency is dissolving and plague is going through it again, Persia has just finished replacing a loose confederation with a centralized military state run by 2 of the most capable kings in its history. Ardashir took the frontier fortresses at the end of the 230s, and in the early 240s, his son Shapur took the throne, and Shapur I is the most dangerous enemy Rome faced between Hannibal and the Arabs. We know an unusual amount about him, and we know it from him, which almost never happens in ancient history, and it is worth pausing on because it is the single most important source in this video. At Naqsh-e-Rustam, near the ruins of Persepolis, there is a rock face with the tombs of the Achaemenid kings cut into it, and in front of it stands a square stone tower. And on 3 sides of that tower, Shapur had his own account of his reign carved, in 3 languages, Middle Persian, Parthian, and Greek. Modern scholars call it the Res Gesta Divi Sapuris, the deeds of the divine Shapur, deliberately echoing the Res Gesta of Augustus, because it is doing the same job. It lists his campaigns, names the cities he took, and describes what he did with the people in them. For this one stretch of Roman history, we can check Rome's homework against the enemy's own stone, and where the 2 disagree, the disagreement is usually the story. Take Shapur's first war with Rome. The young Emperor Gordian III came east in the year 243 with a great expedition, and at first it went well, and then, in early 244, near a place called Misish on the Euphrates, something happened that the 2 sides report in flatly incompatible ways. Shapur's inscription says there was a great battle, that the Roman army was destroyed, that Gordian was killed, and that he renamed the site Peroz Shapur, Victorious Shapur. The Roman tradition admits no battle at all, and says the young emperor died further upstream during the retreat, of a fall from a horse in one telling, and murdered by his own praetorian prefect in another. What is not in dispute is what happened next. The prefect, Philip, became emperor, needed to get home immediately to secure his throne, and bought his way out. 500,000 gold pieces. By the Persian account, the Roman sources do not mention the payment. Of course they do not. Then, in 252 or 253, Shapur came west in force, destroyed a Roman army of 60,000 at Barbalissos, and took Antioch. Antioch was the third city of the Roman Empire, after Rome and Alexandria. 500,000 people, the capital of the Roman East, and it was taken and sacked. And the story that survives is that the Persians came so unexpectedly that the population was in the theater when they arrived, and the audience watching a play looked up to see arrows coming down into the seats. Shapur's inscription lists 37 cities he took in that campaign. And what he did with the people is the point. He did not just loot them, he deported them and settled them in Persia, in new cities built for them and set them to work. Roman craftsmen, Roman engineers, Roman architects moved wholesale 800 miles east. At Shushtar in southwestern Iran, there is a bridge dam across the Karun River, built with Roman labor from the reign of Shapur's captives, and it is still there, and parts of it are still working. And it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Persia did not merely defeat Rome, it harvested it. And then, in the year 260, Shapur did the thing that no one had ever done. Valerian had been emperor since 253, which by the standards of that decade made him a veteran. He was old. He was a senator of the most respectable kind, and he had inherited an empire being attacked on every frontier simultaneously. And he had done the sensible thing and split it, sending his son Gallienus to hold the Rhine and the Danube, while he took the east himself. In the year 260, he was at Edessa, in the north of Mesopotamia, with a field army, and two things were eating it. The first was Shapur. The second was plague, again the disease we call the Plague of Cyprian, which was moving through the Roman world in those years and which was in the camp. The details of what happened are thin and hostile and contradictory, which is exactly what you would expect for the most humiliating event in Roman history. There was a battle at Edessa, or near it, and it went badly. And Valerian sought terms, and went out to meet Shapur in person to negotiate, and was seized. Roman writers, unable to accept the plain version, added a betrayal, saying he was taken by treachery under a flag of truce, and some later Christian writers, who loathed Valerian because he had persecuted them, said his own soldiers handed him over. Shapur's inscription says something simpler and prouder. It says that he fought a great battle with Valerian Caesar, and that Valerian Caesar was taken by his own hands, with his own hands, along with the praetorian prefect and the senators and officers of his army, and that all of them were made prisoners and deported to Persia. An emperor of Rome, alive, in the hands of a foreign king. There is no precedent for it, and there is no procedure for it. Rome had lost emperors to their own guards constantly, but a living emperor in enemy hands was a category error, a thing the Roman state had no way of processing, and the proof of that is what Rome did about it, which was nothing. Nothing at all. No ransom was offered. No expedition was launched. His son Gallienus, who was fighting for the survival of the western half of the empire with everything he had, made no attempt to recover his father, and, so far as the record shows, never publicly mentioned him again. It is one of the coldest silences in Roman history, and it is not really cruelty. It is arithmetic. An emperor who has been captured is finished, and a state fighting on 5 fronts cannot spend an army on a symbol. What it did have to spend was the East itself, because with the field army destroyed, there was nothing between Shapur and the Mediterranean, and he came through and took Antioch again, and Tarsus, and Caesarea in Cappadocia. A city he says had 400,000 people in it, and the columns of prisoners went east again. And Shapur put the moment in stone, several times, at several sites, and the reliefs are why we know exactly how the Persians wanted this understood. At Nakshi Rustam, the Great One, the king on horseback, one Roman emperor kneeling in front of the horse, arms raised, and a second Roman, standing with his wrist held in Shapur's fist. Scholars generally read the kneeling figure as Philip, who bought his peace, and the standing figure as Valerian, held, owned. At Bishapur there are more of them, and one includes a third Roman, dead on the ground under the horse, generally read as Gordian. 3 emperors of Rome in one picture, one dead, one begging, one in the king's hand, carved on a cliff in Persia where the Achaemenid kings are buried, and it is not a boast to a Roman audience, because no Roman would ever see it. It is a message to Persians. and the message is that the great enemy in the West is a thing that can be collected. And then there is the story about the footstool. Lactantius, a Christian writer of the early 4th century with a strong interest in the ugly deaths of persecuting emperors, says that Shapur used Valerian as a mounting block, making the old man kneel so that the king could step on his back to get onto his horse, and that when Valerian eventually died, the skin was flayed off him, dyed red, and hung in a Persian temple. You should hold that one loosely. Lactantius is writing 60 years later with a theological point to make, and the flaying does not appear anywhere in the Persian record, which had every reason to include it. The scholarly consensus is that Valerian probably lived out his life as a high-status prisoner in Bishapur, in the city his fellow captives were building, and died there, which is, in its way, worse than the legend. Not tortured, just kept. Now stop, because this is the middle of the video and the middle of the story, and it is the exact point where the question we started with becomes answerable. Look at the ledger in the year 260. Rome had, 3 times, captured and sacked the Persian capital. Persia had, once, captured the Roman emperor. And the border between them was, give or take, one province in northern Mesopotamia, precisely where it had been 300 years earlier when Pompey declined to answer a letter. 300 years. Every kind of victory each side is capable of, delivered repeatedly by some of the most capable commanders either civilization produced, and the line does not move. Here is why, and it comes in 4 parts. The first part is logistics, and it is the biggest. From Antioch to Ctesiphon is about 800 miles. A Roman army, moving at 15 miles a day, with its baggage, does that in 8 weeks, if nothing goes wrong. Through country, where the campaigning window closes in high summer because there is no fodder and no water off the rivers. An army in the field eats through its supply the way a fire eats a room, and Roman logistics were the best in the ancient world, and they still could not sustain a large force beyond the rivers for more than a season or 2. The Euphrates and the Tigris are the reason Rome could get to Ctesiphon at all, because you can float grain barges down them alongside a marching army. Notice that every successful Roman invasion in this video follows a river, and every single Roman disaster happens when an army leaves one. The second part is that Persia had no vital organ within reach. Take Carthage and you have taken Carthage, and the war is over. Take Ctesiphon and you have taken a city, and the King of Kings is in the Zagros, or on the plateau with his court and his treasury, and the nobility of Iran, and the mountains that separate you from him are 1,000 miles long and defended by geography that turns any army that enters it into a besieging force with no supply, and the same thing works exactly in reverse. Persia could take Antioch, and did, twice, and Antioch is not Rome, and behind it is Anatolia, and then the sea, and then Constantinople, and a Persian army that has taken Antioch is now the one at the end of a very long string. The third part is the one Rome never fixed, and it is not military at all. Every emperor who won a great victory in the East immediately became the most dangerous man in the Roman world, and every emperor who was away in the East was, by definition, a very long way from Rome. Look at how the Eastern campaigns end. Trajan dies, and his conquest is abandoned on day 1 by a successor who needs to consolidate. Varus's victory brings back a plague, and 10 years later, his victorious general, Avidius Cassius, revolts and declares himself emperor. Severus is in the east because he needs a war to justify a throne he took in a civil war. Gordian's expedition ends with his prefect taking the purple. Rome's eastern wars were never allowed to run to completion because Roman politics kept reaching out and pulling the commander home, or killing him, or making him a rival. Persia did not need to defeat Rome in the east. It only needed to last long enough for Rome to do the usual thing to itself. And the fourth part is the simplest. Persia was a state, not a tribal confederation, not a kingdom that could be decapitated, but a civilization with its own literate bureaucracy, its own religion, its own aristocracy, its own long memory, and its own claim to the same land. When Rome broke a Gallic or a German or a Dacian people, that people's leadership was the war, and killing it ended the thing. When Rome broke a Persian army, Persia went home, raised taxes, appointed a new commander, and came back, because there was an institution behind the army that survived the army. Rome had exactly one neighbor like that in its entire history, and this is it. Put those four together, and you get the shape of the whole 700 years. Not a war one side is winning. A pendulum with a hard stop at each end. And speaking of things that survived, this is the moment to answer a question I have been dodging, which is how we know any of this. Because the Roman written sources for the 3rd century are, to put it politely, garbage. Cassius Dio stops. Herodian stops. For the worst 50 years, we have late summaries, a Greek history written 2 centuries later, and the Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies that claims to be 6 authors and is one, that invents documents and letters wholesale, and that in one book pads out its cast by making up several emperors who never existed. So we lean on objects, and the greatest single object in this story was found by accident, in the desert, by soldiers digging a trench. In the spring of 1920, a detachment of British Indian troops fighting in the aftermath of the First World War were digging defensive positions on a bluff above the Euphrates in eastern Syria, and they cut into a wall, and the wall had paintings on it. What they had found was Dura-Europos, a Greek city that became Parthian and then Roman, and that was besieged by Shapur's army around the year 256 and destroyed and never reoccupied. Nobody came back and built on top of it. The Persians undermined the walls. The defenders piled earth against the inside of them to hold them up, and that earthen rampart buried the buildings along the wall and sealed them for 1,700 years. Which is why Dura-Europos has given us the oldest known Christian house church, with a painted baptistery and a synagogue covered floor to ceiling in figurative paintings of biblical scenes, which rewrote what scholars thought Jewish art of that period looked like. It has been called, with justification, the Pompeii of the Syrian desert. But the part that belongs in this video is under the wall. The French and American excavations of the 1930s dug out the siege works and found that the Persians had driven a mine under one of the towers, and that the Roman defenders had heard them and dug a countermine to break in and fight them underground. And in that countermine tunnel, the excavators found the bodies of around 20 Roman soldiers, stacked in a heap in a space a man cannot stand up in, with their equipment, and one Persian soldier, lying separately with his sword and his gold coins. The interpretation for 70 years was the obvious one. The two mining parties met. There was a fight in the dark. The Romans lost, and the Persians piled the bodies to block the tunnel and set a fire. Then in 2009, an archaeologist named Simon James went back over the excavation records and pointed out what the geometry actually shows. The Roman bodies are stacked in a deliberate pile at the mouth of the Persian mine. They are lying at the point where they were trying to get in. And in the Persian gallery, beside a brazier and bellows, the original excavators had recorded crystals of sulfur and lumps of bitumen. Sulfur and bitumen, burned together in a confined space, produce sulfur dioxide, which in a tunnel is not smoke, it is a chemical weapon. It attacks the lungs, and it kills in under a minute. And the argument is that the Persian miners heard the Romans coming, prepared the fire, and when the Roman breach opened, they pumped the gas into it with bellows, and the Roman party died in the dark almost instantly, and were then dragged into a pile to seal the gallery. If James is right, and the reading is now widely accepted, that stack of bodies is the earliest physical evidence of chemical warfare anywhere in the world. I put this in for a reason beyond how horrifying it is. Everything I have told you about Shapur, we have from him, on a cliff, with an obvious interest in his own greatness. Everything Rome says about Persia is written by men who need the defeat to have been treachery. And then there is a tunnel under a wall where nobody was performing for anyone, and it tells you what the war was actually like at the working end, which is that the two most sophisticated states on Earth were, by the middle of the 3rd century, applying their best engineers to the problem of killing each other underground. Rome's east, by the way, was not saved by Rome. In the wreckage after Valerian, the man who put Shapur back across the river was a Roman client, the ruler of the caravan city of Palmyra, Odenathus, who cut up the Persian army on its way home, and then twice marched to the walls of Ctesiphon himself. Rome, having no army in the region, gave him a grand title and let him get on with it. And after he was assassinated, his widow Zenobia took the same army and seized Egypt and most of the Roman East for herself. Which is another video. The recovery of the frontier is real, but it is worth knowing who did it. And then, in the year 283, the Emperor Carrhae marched east while Persia was distracted by a civil war of its own and took Ctesiphon, the fourth Roman capture of the Persian capital. And there is your number. And then died in his tent, allegedly struck by lightning in a thunderstorm, and his army immediately went home. 15 years later, the Emperor Galerius, after being beaten once, came back and destroyed a Persian army and captured the king's harem and treasury. And the Treaty of 298 gave Rome the best eastern frontier it would ever have, 5 provinces beyond the Tigris and Armenia in the Roman sphere, and it held for 40 years. Which is worth noticing, because it is the single most successful thing Rome ever did on this frontier, and it was done by a man who had just lost, coming back with a better plan, and it did not involve trying to conquer Iran. That settlement is what the 4th century spent itself arguing about, and it produced the last great Roman attempt to solve the problem by conquest, and the man who made it is one of the strangest people ever to rule the Roman Empire. Julian was the nephew of Constantine, the emperor who made Rome Christian. He had been raised Christian in effective captivity after most of his family were murdered in the succession bloodletting of the 330s. He was a scholar, a genuine one, who wrote philosophy and satire, and who privately abandoned Christianity and converted back to the old gods. And when he unexpectedly became sole emperor in the year 361, he declared it publicly and set about trying to restore paganism across the empire by intelligence and legislation rather than persecution. He is the last non-Christian emperor of Rome, and everything he wanted depended on being taken seriously as a ruler, and nothing in the 4th century made a ruler serious like a Persian war. So in the spring of 363 he invaded, and he did it on a scale nobody had attempted in a century. Around 65,000 men, and a fleet of over 1,000 boats built to carry his supplies down the Euphrates, which tells you he had read his history and understood the logistics. He split his force, sending some 30,000 men north with orders to come down through Armenia and join him, and took the main army down the river, storming fortress after fortress, and arrived under the walls of Ctesiphon, and beat the Persian army waiting there. And then he was standing in the same place every Roman who had ever got this far had stood. The city was enormous and fortified and would take a long siege. The northern column had not arrived. The King of Kings, Shapur II, had not been beaten, only avoided, and was somewhere to the east with the main field army, refusing battle and burning the crops in front of them. It was June. The heat was rising. Julian made the decision that ended him. He turned away from Ctesiphon and marched east into the interior to find and beat Shapur. And because the fleet could not follow him upstream against the current and he could not spare the men to guard it, he burned it. Over 1,000 ships. Later Roman writers said he was tricked into it by a Persian deserter, which is a story Roman writers reach for whenever something is unbearable. Reading the campaign, it looks less like a trick and more like a man who has run out of good options, choosing the boldest bad one. The army marched into scorched country, could not find an enemy that did not want to be found, ran short of food, and turned back north towards Roman territory in the worst heat of the year, harried the entire way in exactly the manner Crassus and Antony had been harried. And on the 26th of June, 363, during a running skirmish on the march, Julian rode out to rally a threatened part of the column without stopping to put on his mail, and a spear went into his side, and he died in his tent that night, aged 31. The officers elected a senior guard commander named Jovian on the spot, and Jovian, with a starving army in enemy territory, accepted Shapur's terms, and the terms were brutal. Rome gave up all 5 provinces beyond the Tigris that Galerius had won, gave up Armenia's protection, and gave up the fortress city of Nisibis, which had held out against 3 Persian sieges and had never fallen, and whose population was ordered to leave. A Roman army walking out of a city it had never lost because of a treaty signed to buy its own passage home is as good an image as this war produces. And with Julian died the last serious Roman attempt to conquer Persia, and something else besides, because the pagan restoration died with him. The empire was Christian from that day forward without a serious challenge. A spear thrown by a man whose name we do not know, in a skirmish in a desert in Iraq, is one of the load-bearing accidents in the history of the Western world. After Julian, both sides did something they had never managed before, which was to leave each other alone. For most of the 5th century, the eastern frontier is quiet, and the reason is that both empires suddenly had the same problem at the same time. The steppe emptied westwards. Rome got the Goths, and then the Huns, and then the collapse of its entire western half, and Persia got the Hephthalites, the people the Greeks called the White Huns, who beat the Persians repeatedly, killed one king of kings in an ambush, and forced another to pay tribute for years. There are moments in the 5th century when the two ancient enemies are effectively cooperating, and one Persian king wrote to Constantinople asking for money to help hold the pass through the Caucasus, on the reasonable grounds that the nomads coming through it would not stop at Persia. Sometimes Rome even paid. When the wars restart in the 6th century, they are wars of a different character, fought by two states that now understand each other extremely well. Justinian and Khosrow I, who are the two most famous rulers of their respective empires, spent decades in a relationship that alternated between formal war and a treaty grandly named the Eternal Peace, which lasted 8 years. Khosrow took Antioch again in 540, deported its population again, and built them a new Antioch outside Ctesiphon, complete with baths and a hippodrome, and called it Khosrow's Better Antioch, which is either magnanimity or the single most cutting insult in ancient diplomacy. The border, once more, did not meaningfully move. By this point, both sides had stopped pretending. There were formal protocols for exchanging ambassadors, treaties with terms about trade routes and religious minorities, and an accepted convention that the two rulers addressed each other as brothers, the two eyes of the world. And then, at the beginning of the 7th century, after 650 years of a war neither side could win, they finally fought the one that mattered. It started, like everything else in this story, with a Roman civil war. The Emperor Maurice, who had helped Khosrow II onto the Persian throne, was overthrown and murdered in 602 by a mutinous officer named Phocas, and Khosrow, who owed Maurice a genuine personal debt and who had just been handed the perfect pretext, declared war to avenge him. And this time, he did not raid, and he did not negotiate a province off the map. He took the entire Roman East. Syria fell. Antioch fell. For the last time. In 614, the Persians took Jerusalem after a siege and carried off the relic of the true cross to Ctesiphon, which detonated in the Christian Roman world in a way no territorial loss could have. In 619, they took Egypt. The granary and the grain dole that had fed Constantinople for 3 centuries stopped. Persian armies stood on the Bosporus and looked across the water at the walls of Constantinople. And in 626, a Persian force on the Asian shore, coordinated with an Avar and Slav army, besieging the land walls from Europe. And for a few weeks in the summer of that year, the Roman Empire was, for practical purposes, the city of Constantinople and whatever the fleet could reach. The empire was saved by the sea walls, by the fleet, and by an emperor named Heraclius, who did the least likely thing available. Rather than defend, he took what was left of the army out of the capital while it was still under threat, went north around the Black Sea, allied with the Turks of the western steppe, and drove straight into the Persian heartland from the north, through Armenia, bypassing Mesopotamia entirely. It is the campaign that every previous Roman had said was impossible, and it worked, because Heraclius was not trying to conquer Iran, he was trying to break the King of Kings politically. In December of 627, he destroyed the last Persian field army near the ruins of Nineveh, burned Khosrow's palaces, and stood within reach of Ctesiphon. Khosrow II, having lost everything he had won, was overthrown by his own nobles and his own son and killed in a cell. The Persians gave everything back. Egypt, Syria, Palestine, the true cross. In 630, Heraclius carried the relic back into Jerusalem in person. Rome had won. After 680 years, Rome had definitively, finally won the Persian War. It had 4 years to enjoy it. Look at what those 26 years of total war had actually done to the two of them. Both empires had spent everything. Rome had melted down church plate to pay the troops, lost and retaken its richest provinces, and had its administration in Syria and Egypt smashed twice, first by Persian conquest and then by Roman reconquest, in living memory of the same taxpayers. Persia had gone through a civil war and a succession collapse, running through something like a dozen rulers in 4 years, its army destroyed, its nobility split, its treasury gone. Both of them had exhausted their manpower, and both of them had spent decades neglecting the desert frontier to the south, where they had for centuries managed the Arab tribes by paying client kingdoms to police them, and where both of those client systems had recently been allowed to lapse. In the year 636, a Muslim Arab army beat the main Roman field army at the river Yarmouk in what is now Jordan, and Syria was gone permanently. Within a year or so of that, at Qadisiyah near the Euphrates, another Arab army beat the main Persian field army, and shortly afterwards took Ctesiphon, and that was the fifth and final capture of the Persian capital, and the only one that was permanent. The last king of kings, Yazdegerd III, spent a decade running east across his own empire looking for an army, and was murdered near Merv in 651. In the same corner of the world where the prisoners from Carrhae had been settled 700 years before, the Sasanian Empire did not shrink. It ended, entirely, inside 20 years. Rome, which had walls and a fleet and Anatolia to retreat into, survived and became the medieval Greek empire we call Byzantium, and it never held Syria or Egypt again. Two superpowers spent 7 centuries proving neither could destroy the other, fought each other to complete exhaustion to settle it, and were then removed, one entirely and one by half, in a single generation, by a power that both of them had regarded as a policing problem on their southern flank. So, the number I asked you for at the start, out of the 680-odd years between the first Roman crossing of the Euphrates and the fall of Ctesiphon, how much of it was war? It is a hard figure to pin down, because low-level raiding never really stopped, and because both sides fought proxy wars in Armenia and the Caucasus during periods they officially called peace. But if you count the years in which Roman and Persian field armies were actually campaigning against each other, you land somewhere around 200 years out of nearly 700. Something like 70% of the relationship was peace. And that is the last thing I want you to take away from it, because it is the part the story of Rome never tells you. Most of the time, for most of 7 centuries, the two greatest empires on earth traded, argued about Armenia, sent each other embassies, complained about each other's treatment of religious minorities, and left each other alone. The wars are what got written down, because peace is not an event. Which finally answers the question we started with, properly. Rome could not conquer Persia because Persia was not a thing Rome had a method for. Rome's method was to find the enemy's center and take it, and Persia's center was 800 miles past the last river, behind a mountain range, in a country that could not feed an invading army, defended by a state that could survive the loss of every city Rome was able to reach, and Persia could not conquer Rome for the mirror image of the same reason. The two of them were, uniquely in the ancient world, each other's exact structural match, and the 700 years of fighting is not a failure by either one. It is what it looks like when an unstoppable force meets another unstoppable force, with a desert in between. There is a coda, and it is a strange one. Go and look at a map today. The line that Pompey declined to draw, and that Crassus crossed, and that Trajan annexed and Hadrian gave back, and that Julian died beyond, still exists. The eastern border of modern Turkey, and the line where Turkey and Syria and Iraq meet, sits astonishingly close to where Rome and Persia settled, and the cultural and religious fault line that runs through that country is in large part the fault line those two empires spent 7 centuries grinding into it. Nisibis is Nusaybin, on the Turkish-Syrian border with a wall through it. Dura-Europos, the city with the tunnel, was on the Euphrates in Syria, and in the 2010s it was systematically looted during the Syrian civil war, its surface churned into craters by treasure hunters. Which is the most depressing sentence in this script. The frontier is still there. It is still contested. It just has different names on it. And the last thing. Remember Gan Ying, The Chinese envoy standing on the shore of the Persian Gulf in the year 97, being told by Parthian sailors that the voyage to Rome would take 2 years and break his heart. At the moment he turned round, the Roman Empire and the Han Empire between them held something close to half of the human race. They were the 2 largest and richest states on the planet. They each knew perfectly well that the other one existed. They were trading enormous quantities of goods with each other through intermediaries, and neither of them ever managed to send a single confirmed embassy to the other. The empire in the middle made sure of it. That is the next video. What Rome knew about China, what China knew about Rome, why they never met, and the 2,000-year-old story that a Roman legion lost at Carrhae ended up in western China fighting for a Chinese general, which is a claim with real evidence behind it, real scholarship against it, and a village in the Hexi corridor full of people who believe they are the descendants. If you want that when it lands, subscribe, and I will see you there.